Airline drama. Man demands woman's seat for his kid. She doesn't back down. 2025. Phoenix Sky Harbor International. The terminal buzzes with summer chaos. Roller bags thudding. Overhead announcements garbled by static. Travelers drenched in sweat and urgency. Flight 209 to Chicago is boarding. Among them, 34-year-old Maya Thompson. Black, bold, and battle-tested, slips through the crowd with quiet precision. She's a senior graphic designer from Oakland. No stranger to red-eye flights or last-minute client meetings. Maya slides into seat 12A. Her window view, a small luxury she paid an extra $45 for, offering a moment of calm before the storm. It's not just about a view. It's her slice of stillness in a world that rarely slows down. Noise-canceling headphones in her tote. A hardcover novel tucked under one arm. She settles in with the kind of focus that says she's earned every ounce of peace this window seat offers. Maya isn't just traveling. She's reclaiming space, her own way. While passengers jostle and overhead bins slam shut around her, she buckles up, exhales, and prepares for 4 uninterrupted hours of silence at 30,000 feet. What she doesn't know is that this small, paid-for peace is about to be challenged, and how she handles it will speak volumes. Not just about her, but about dignity, boundaries, and what happens when you refuse to shrink for someone else's comfort. The hum of the cabin faded into a distant murmur as Maya adjusted her seatbelt, cracked open her novel, and placed her headphones within reach, ready to disappear into her own bubble for the next few hours. She had just taken her first calming breath when the soft shuffle of dress shoes interrupted her focus. A shadow loomed in the narrow aisle. Standing over her was a man, white, mid-40s, clean-cut with a sculpted jaw, a Rolex peeking beneath his cuff, and a cashmere coat folded over one arm like he had stepped out of a corporate lifestyle magazine. In his other hand, he tugged gently on the wrist of a little girl, no older than 6, her ponytail lopsided, her eyes wide and darting around the cabin like a trapped bird. The man didn't smile. He didn't ask. He pointed to Maya's window seat and said, not softly, not politely, but with the cool authority of someone used to getting what he wants. Excuse me, I need you to switch seats. My daughter needs the window. Maya blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. The little girl clutched a faded unicorn plush and looked up anxiously, as if the plane's walls were closing in on her. Maya's eyes flicked between the child and the man, but it was his tone that stuck like a thorn. Not, would you mind? Not, is there any way? Just a flat demand, delivered with the expectation that she'd fold. She gave a tight, polite smile, the kind worn by women who've learned how to say no without inviting war. I'm sorry, but I paid for this seat, she said evenly. A brief silence. The man's lips twitched, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face like the idea of rejection had never occurred to him. He gestured to the open aisle seat beside her. She gets nervous without the window, he said, his voice dipped in frustration now. She needs it. Maya leaned back slightly, brows raised. The implication was loud and clear. You, a stranger, are now responsible for this child's comfort. She glanced at the girl again, then back at him. I understand, Maya said, calm but unwavering, but I paid extra for this seat. If a window's that important, you should have booked it ahead of time. His eyes narrowed. The polite mask cracked. She's a child, he said, slower this time, as if explaining to someone incapable of empathy. Surely you understand how stressful flying can be. Maya nodded, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Which is why I made sure I had what I needed to be comfortable. I'm sorry. Her hands tightened slightly on her book, anticipating what was next. She knew that look, that tone, that entitled edge that came wrapped in polite packaging. She could feel it shift in the air, the beginning of a scene. He let out a sharp, performative sigh, designed to draw attention, and then said just loudly enough for the rows around them to hear. This is what's wrong with people these days. No kindness, no decency. Heads turned. The quiet hum of pre-flight calm cracked under the pressure of a brewing public moment. A man 2 rows back paused his podcast. Someone across the aisle leaned in. Maya's chest tightened, heat rising under her collar. She had become the villain in his impromptu social theater. But she didn't flinch. She sat straighter, eyes steady, hands still. This wasn't about a seat anymore, it was about control. About entitlement. About how quickly the image of a difficult black woman could be projected onto someone simply choosing not to bend. The man wasn't asking anymore. He was performing, for the child. For the passengers. For the idea that he was a good father and she was a heartless stranger. But Maya had seen this scene before. She had lived it, worked through it, and outgrown it, and she wasn't about to rewrite her boundaries just to make a stranger feel powerful. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. Didn't sigh in exasperation. Didn't fumble for an excuse. She just looked the man squarely in the eye, her tone even and her posture steady, and said, "I'm sorry, but I paid for this seat." No wobble, no apology tucked between the words, just truth. Plain and unbothered. The man blinked, like her words were in another language. Entitlement doesn't always prepare people to hear no. His lips tightened as he motioned again to the aisle seat, as if repeating the offer would change the answer. "She gets anxious without the window," he said, gesturing toward his daughter. "I thought you'd understand." Maya's face didn't shift. She did understand. She understood all too well. She understood that this wasn't just about the girl or the window. It was about the assumption that her comfort, her planning, her extra payment didn't matter as much as his last-minute regret. It was about the belief that because she was sitting alone, because she was a woman, and yes, because she was black, she'd feel obligated to surrender. That she'd feel guilty enough to fold. But Maya had long since stopped letting guilt make decisions for her. She had learned the hard way that being accommodating often meant being erased. "I do understand," she replied, her voice like glass, clear, smooth, and unbreakable. "Which is why you should have booked the seat ahead of time." The air between them thickened. Around them, seatbelts clicked, passengers rustled, but their world had narrowed to a quiet, private standoff. The man stared at her like she had personally offended the laws of decency. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Then louder, his voice rising just enough for the surrounding rows to catch the performance. "This is what's wrong with people these days. No kindness, no heart." Maya felt the shift immediately, how the eyes started to drift toward her. Some subtle, some direct. One man paused mid-scroll on his phone. A woman across the aisle leaned in, eyes sharp, lips pursed. It was starting. The social pressure. The unspoken expectation that she, the solo traveler, the woman of color, would now defend her choice not to give up something she had rightfully paid for. It was always the same setup, polite demand, refusal, then the performance of martyrdom to an invisible jury of strangers. Her heart beat faster, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. She had seen this tactic before, in boardrooms, in coffee shops, even in classrooms growing up. Make a scene. Frame the refusal as selfishness. Frame the self-respect as rudeness. But Maya wasn't flinching. Not this time. She adjusted her book in her lap, looked out the window briefly, then back at him. "You're asking me to give up something I paid for," she said. "If this seat mattered that much, you should have made sure it was reserved." "That's not on me." The girl tugged lightly on her father's coat, anxious and uncertain. But the man ignored her. His eyes were locked on Maya. His pride wounded, his ego churning in real time. He had expected gratitude or compliance. Instead, he was facing grace under pressure. The worst kind of resistance, unshakable calm. And for men like him, calm from women like Maya was infuriating. "So you're really not going to move?" he asked. Voice dipped in disbelief. Maya shook her head once. Firm but not rude. "No, sir, I'm not," he scoffed, then laughed, dry and hollow, like the sound of a man who's lost control of the narrative. "Can you believe this?" he called out. Not to anyone in particular, but to the cabin itself. A grown woman won't even switch with a kid. Incredible. The tension ratcheted up, subtle but sharp. Passengers were listening now. The man in 11C shifted in his seat. A teenager in 12C stopped chewing her gum. The volume hadn't reached yelling, but it didn't need to. The message was loud. "Look at her. Look at the woman who won't budge for a child." But Maya didn't shrink. She didn't stumble. She let the silence build around her like armor. Because sometimes, the most powerful protest isn't shouting or explaining. It's staying still, staying seated, holding the line. And in that moment, Maya wasn't just holding a seat, she was holding dignity, boundaries, and the right to take up space without apology. The man wasn't done, not by a long shot. When Maya stood her ground, calm and composed, he didn't argue facts, he switched tactics. His voice took on that carefully curated mix of disappointment and public performance. Just loud enough to reach the ears of nearby passengers. "Wow," he said, shaking his head with theatrical disbelief. "You'd think someone would have a little more compassion these days. My daughter's terrified of flying. And this woman won't even switch seats for a child." His words floated in the air like bait, designed to hook the empathy of everyone within earshot. Maya didn't respond. Not yet. She'd seen this playbook before. Make the refusal seem cold. Make the audience feel like there's a moral debt she owes. It wasn't about the seat anymore, it was about framing her as the problem. He looked around, catching eyes, hoping for allies. "Can you believe that?" he asked the air, gesturing broadly. "She's sitting there like it's her throne or something. A little kindness goes a long way." That last part, he aimed it directly at her, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maya felt the shift, the way eyes began to linger, the subtle tension rising like cabin pressure. One woman 2 rows ahead gave her a glance that said, "Maybe you should just move." A man across the aisle narrowed his eyes as if silently judging her character. And just when it couldn't get more predictable, he muttered under his breath, "Low." But not low enough, typical. One word, loaded, meant to sting, meant to remind her of the stereotypes he hoped others would silently co-sign. Maya heard it, felt it like a slap wrapped in silk. But she didn't flinch, not on the outside, on the inside. She clenched her jaw, because that word wasn't about the seat, the window, or even his daughter. It was about her identity, about putting her in a box labeled angry, difficult, selfish. And that word? That was the line. Maya turned her gaze toward him, not angry, not shaken, but sharper now, colder. She didn't need to say anything. He'd already said enough. Around them, the energy shifted. The performance was unraveling. Not everyone bought it. A guy in a hoodie looked up and frowned. A woman in the aisle raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. And slowly, the crowd began to see what this really was, not a father defending his child, but a man who expected obedience and couldn't handle defiance, especially from someone like her. Just as the tension in row 12 was beginning to buzz like static, a new presence entered the frame, tall, composed, and radiating no-nonsense authority. Flight attendant Dana Morales, mid-40s, crisp uniform, braided bun, and eyes that missed nothing, stepped into the aisle like she'd seen this movie one too many times. Her voice cut through the rising noise with steady grace. "Is there a problem here?" The man turned to her, relief flickering across his face, as if backup had arrived. "Yes," he snapped quickly, gesturing toward Maya. "This woman is refusing to move so my daughter can have the window seat. She gets anxious on flights." Dana didn't react right away. She studied him for a second longer than was comfortable, then turned to Maya. "Is this your assigned seat?" "Yes." Maya nodded, her voice measured. Dana looked back at the man. Voice cool, professional, but edged with steel. "Sir, she has the seat assigned to her." He wasn't having it. "I'm not saying it's not her seat. I'm asking if the airline can step in and do the right thing. Isn't that what customer service is for?" Dana straightened, a flicker of exhaustion passing through her eyes before she dropped the truth like a weight. "Customer service," she said firmly, "does not mean asking one paying passenger to give up what they rightfully reserved just to make another feel better." The words landed hard. There was no apology in her tone, no sugarcoating for his ego. She wasn't here to cater to entitlement. The man blinked, clearly unprepared for pushback from someone in uniform. Dana didn't flinch. "If a window seat is that important, I'd be happy to check for any unassigned ones. But I will not move her. She has every right to stay where she is." The cabin seemed to freeze for a breath. Even the overhead bins stopped rattling. Maya felt a quiet swell of gratitude, not because she needed defending, but because someone had finally said it out loud. Her seat wasn't up for negotiation just because someone else wanted it more loudly. Dana's tone had shifted the energy entirely. No longer was Maya the subject of silent judgment. Now, the man's insistence looked exactly like what it was: entitlement, exposed in full view. But Marcus wasn't letting it go. Not even close. The sting of being told no by a woman, by a stranger. And worse, in front of an audience. Had him spiraling. He paced slightly in the aisle like a CEO losing control of the boardroom, throwing glances around as if searching for someone to back him up. Someone to say Maya was wrong. So that's it? He barked, looking at Dana with disbelief. We're really going to reward selfishness now? His voice carried, sharp enough to cut through the cabin's low hum. Maya stayed silent, steady in her seat, her hand resting calmly on her book. But Dana didn't waver either. Sir, I've already explained. She has the right to her seat. Please return to yours so we can complete boarding. Marcus scoffed, then let out a bitter laugh that felt staged. Can you believe this? He asked no one in particular. A woman refusing to help a child. And the staff just watches it happen. Unbelievable. Some passengers squirmed. Others kept their eyes locked on their phones, unwilling to be dragged into the drama. But Maya noticed a man in a green hoodie a few rows back give a slow, deliberate shake of his head. And a woman in the aisle seat across from her murmured, "She's not wrong." The tide was turning, and Marcus felt it. He didn't like it. That loss of control, that unraveling grip. He stepped forward one more time, voice low and venomous, leaning close to Maya's row. "Proud of yourself?" he hissed, pretending to be the victim. "We all see what's going on." Maya didn't flinch. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his stare with a calm that burned hotter than any outburst. Dana stepped in immediately. "Sir, step away now," she ordered, tone firm and final. And then, back up arrived Trevor, another flight attendant, tall and broad-shouldered, radio already in hand. "Captain's been notified," he said. "You'll need to collect your things." For a moment, Marcus froze, processing the reality. His chest rose and fell with shallow anger. But he knew it was over. He turned, grabbed his daughter's hand, and stormed down the aisle as a wave of silence followed him. The cabin seemed to exhale. A few whispered, "About time," floated in the air. Dana checked in with Maya. "You okay?" And Maya nodded. She was, because this wasn't just about a seat. It was about not folding. And finally, someone else had told the man who thought the world owed him everything. No. Maya never raised her voice. She didn't argue, didn't lash out, didn't stoop to meet Marcus in his storm of entitlement. While he ranted, while he threw barbed words into the air hoping one would land and shame her into surrender, she sat still, back straight, gaze calm, hands resting on her book like a quiet anchor in the middle of turbulence. That was her power, not in shouting, not in dramatic rebuttals, but in her refusal to flinch. Every time he tried to provoke her, to paint her as cold or unkind, she answered with silence sharper than any insult. She didn't owe him emotion. She didn't owe the crowd a justification. Her presence, confident, composed, unapologetic, was the loudest statement in the cabin. And it echoed around her. People began to see it too. The strength it takes to hold the line when you're being pushed, prodded, judged, when someone tries to twist your dignity into defiance. Maya never wavered. She didn't need to explain why her comfort mattered. She didn't need to list all the times she'd been expected to give more, bend more, smile more. She just stayed exactly where she was, grounded, because sometimes, the boldest resistance is choosing not to move when the world expects you to shrink. And in that seat, with a plane full of eyes watching, Maya showed what real strength looks like, not aggression, not rage, but the quiet, unwavering refusal to be diminished by the time Flight 209 was cruising above the clouds. Maya sat quietly by her window. The world stretched wide beneath her, her book back in hand, but something had shifted. What started as a simple seat dispute had unraveled into something bigger, something louder than any outburst. It had become a symbol, a moment where dignity didn't shout. It stood still. Maya's refusal to yield wasn't just about a window seat. It was about every time someone like her was expected to give in, to move, to make space for someone else's comfort at the expense of her own. And this time, she didn't, no matter her skin color, her gender, or the assumptions tied to both. Maya owned her space with grace and unshakable calm. That's what made the story resonate, not just with the people on that flight, but with everyone who's ever been told to shrink, to stay quiet, to be the bigger person at their own expense. Maya didn't play into their script. She rewrote it, and sometimes, that's all it takes. A quiet no, a steady spine, a seat rightfully held. What would you have done in her place? Have you ever had to stand your ground in a moment like this? Drop your story in the comments. We want to hear from you. If this story hit you in the chest the way it hit us, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that speak truth, power, and everyday courage.